Welcome to the CEDR and Linklaters discussion on workplace activism. In it, I interview Nicola Rabson, partner at Linklaters, and Laurie Ollivant, senior practice development lawyer and co-head of the diversity faculty at Linklaters. We look at workplace activism not only from the challenges that it poses to organisations, but also the opportunities as well. I hope you enjoy. Laurie, Nicola, welcome to CEDR, and thank you very much for coming in today to talk to us about workplace activism or employee activism, and that's actually a discussion we'll probably get into about the terminology. And I think it's quite fitting that we're actually doing it a week out from the US election, because for many people what's going on in the States is really a poster child for a lot of the challenges and divisions that we're seeing in different societies around the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why earlier in the year Gartner said that 2024 was going to be the year in which workplace conflict hit an all-time high. Not just the political side of things, but there's also pushback on DEI initiatives, frustrations about climate inaction or action, labour relations, geopolitical crises. So I think herein lies the challenge for organisations, but also I suppose the opportunity. And it's an area that CEDR's been doing a lot of work in. And when I was putting together our white paper back in April, I think it was, I came across a lot of work that you had both done several years previous. So very much ahead of the curve of us, but it seems a lot of people on this topic. So that's why it's so great to be able to have you both here today to discuss this really important and quite vast area. But as I say, it's probably good to start with the term that we're using. So CEDR, we've been using employee activism, but I know you prefer workplace activism. So I wonder if you want to just start by talking about the term and why you prefer workplace.
Yeah, well, I think when we're talking about workplace activism, it's because the work that we do in advising employers and businesses, the types of activism that we're seeing is much broader than just coming from the employee. So it's not just employee, worker, agency worker, contractor. It's encompassing shareholder activism, investor activism, activism from trade unions or recognised bodies which aren't an employee of the workplace but are associated with it in some way, or other office holders and directors. So for us and the work that we do, it's much broader than just employee activism or shareholder activism. And so it's all types of activism from the macro to the micro that's happening within the workplace.
Yeah. And I think, we came up with this, we coined this phrase quite a few years ago, as you've recognised. Yeah. And I think it was really important that we didn't associate it just with employees. We were very aware, so shareholder activism had been spoken about. It was a frequently used term in the city and much further afield, but there was nothing really that spoke about what we were seeing at that time in the workplace. So we were getting far more issues being raised by individuals, not just about their treatment, but interestingly the treatment that they were seeing of others in the workplace as well. Yeah. We were seeing more collective, so more groups of people getting together and demanding that their employer or the institution in which they consult or provide work took a stance in respect of some of these political issues. Yeah. And so we were quite keen to come up with a term that caught all of this and didn't exclude anything, which is why we came up with workplace activism. And I think you referenced earlier before we were actually recording that you had listened to the podcast that I think we did in 2020, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so that's really why we chose workplace activism. I think it was very important to use the word activism, which does have different meanings to different people, as you will be aware, and obviously Laurie is aware. But workplace was really important from our perspective to use, because I think it is significantly broader than employee activism. Employee activism is one part of workplace activism. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting you've talked about sort of it's happening at an individual level and then a group level, but also inside the organisation and outside the organisation. So those are really, really critical parts. And I sort of mentioned the fact that things seem to have been coming to a head in recent times, but is this a new phenomenon, or actually has it been around for a while, maybe in different guises or different forms?
I don't think it's new. I think it's been around for as long as the workplace has. It's just the way in which it manifests itself has changed. And it may have been amplified more in recent years because of the big social movements we've had around Me Too, Black Lives Matter, coming back to work after the COVID pandemic. it's really shifted the way in which we work, and so the way in which we report issues and what we want from the workplace has changed to a lot of people. And so it's definitely not new. I think it's just the way in which it surfaces may be new. And a lot of that is to do with technology as well. So the increase in instant communication channels, both within the workplace and outside, how people communicate with each other. But social media's got a big part to play in this too.
So would you say there's a sort of heightened expectation around what companies should be saying and doing, and particularly the leadership with respect to workplace activism?
Without doubt. So I don't think even 10 years ago you would expect employers to be making statements about political situations outside of the country in which they operate. Indeed, you probably wouldn't have even expected them to make any commentary. Now what you hear is people expecting leaders to take a stance in relation to situations, and we've seen that in the last year more than ever. And employees, workers are willing to vote with their feet. And they're also willing to make demands and criticise those leaders if they're not reflecting what they expect them to reflect. Now, we all may have very different views on what a leader should do. I certainly think a leader needs to step back and think about what their role is, and should they really be sharing their personal views, or should they be thinking about what's in the best interests of this organisation as a whole. But I think this is an incredibly challenging area for businesses and for leaders to get right.
Yeah. And that, sorry, Laurie.
I was just going to say, for a lot of those issues as well, historically, remaining silent or neutral or apolitical may have been the business as usual default position, whereas now, for a lot of these issues, I don't think you can, because inferences can be drawn from that, particularly around diversity-related issues as well. It could be misinterpreted for prejudice or complacency, so there's a lot to think about in terms of how you position a response and what is the right thing to do and to say.
Yeah, and are these demands, is this sort of, this activism, is it a generational thing, or is that too simplistic? What's the sort of factors that are going into this melting pot? I suppose generation is quite an obvious one, but presumably not the only thing present.
I think it's expectations as well. So, of course, once a leader starts to speak out, so we saw that particularly, not so much in the aftermath of Me Too actually, but particularly in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, you saw a lot of individuals step up and say, positive statements about what their expectations of the world and their workplace were. And then I think the question, so that kind of raises expectations on the other side for that to happen each time there is a societal event. And so I think people of all generations now expect, or are more likely to expect, their leaders, their employer to make statements because they've seen them do so.
Yeah, and it's the speed at which it's happening as well,
There are consequences for senior leaders with these issues though, in terms of how they respond and what they say, and personal accountability for it, and some risk around it. There was a tribunal judgment a couple of years ago, which I think is always a good example of how this can go wrong. So even a well-intentioned leader who thinks they are making comments in support of an initiative, a diversity initiative in this case, could be misinterpreted, or actually then action could be taken which is found to harass other employees. So in this case, it was a deputy CEO who had made a comment to the whole organisation in support of trans employees transitioning whilst they're working within the company. And a tribunal heavily criticised this individual, the senior leader, for making that comment as being highly inappropriate, because his support, which was expressing his personal views, then led to other action which was found to have harassed an employee with gender-critical beliefs. So when you've got different views, a melting pot of different views within the workforce, and then you have a senior leader who's essentially picking a side, even if they think they're doing the right thing and showing support for a minority group, it's all the positioning and the messaging around it and their personal opinions which are coming across that they need to be very careful with.
And it's significant risk, I think, for leaders now. And I certainly see when I'm interacting with clients or board level individuals, those individuals rightly are very aware of the individual risk that they run in this space, because of course they are senior people, and what they say, what they communicate is listened to, and can go wrong very quickly if they say something that somebody takes offence in relation to, or doesn't reflect a critical minority group's positioning. Senior individuals are much more aware of their individual personal risk, and I think that can drive poor decision making, of course.
Yes.
Because if someone starts to focus on how will this impact me, that doesn't necessarily drive the right type of decisions that you want made at the most senior levels of institutions.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So how that sort of tees us up nicely to explore. So how are you advising individuals and businesses on engaging with this, as we've outlined, very challenging area?
So I think we advise in lots of ways. Let me start with the most obvious. For what we do is it's normally, or most of the time, it's reactive. So that's when a group of employees have raised an issue in relation to potentially the behaviours of a group or an individual, and we have seen a significant uptick, as has anyone in our space, in investigations. So most of the time it's reactive, responding to a situation, whether that's a grievance, someone blowing the whistle, whether there's a disciplinary, whether somebody has suddenly decided to put something on social media about the behaviours or what is happening in their workplace. And then we're taking that information and advising holistically, I like to think of it. I think quite often people try to silo it as a legal risk or an an employee relations HR risk or a communications risk. Actually, what's really critical in this space is that you take a view across all of those areas and then look at what you do proactively as well.
Yeah.
And there are ways in which you can be proactive about it, and how we're working with businesses too, because for those business leaders that recognise this is an area of risk and probably a mainstay of corporate life now, so they have to understand it and have suitable governance and risk management frameworks in place around it. And a lot of that will come down to your policies. So having very clear and consistent policies in place around what your expectations are for good behaviour, bad behaviour. Social media policies, making sure it's very clear to all of your employees what they can and should not be saying on social media, whether that's on LinkedIn in a professional capacity or more in a personal, private life capacity too. And that trickles through all of your other policies around raising grievances, speaking up, whistleblowing, reporting concerns, bullying, harassment, the whole suite of it.
Yeah, and on that piece, because obviously presumably a lot of this is playing out day to day within teams. And have you seen anything around, on that training and development piece, the need for managers to be able to better, at first instance, handle instances of these things coming to the surface with people falling out and whatever?
Yeah, you've really got me on something I'm quite passionate about. Okay. So most people will speak up, right? Yeah. So, and lots of the training has always been focused on ensuring people speak up, that they raise issues. Forever, maybe in 2010, we created, I along with some partners, created a whole programme based on listening up. Because with the best will in the world, if people are speaking up but no one's listening, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose you could have it's great to have that sort of focus on skills and the humour and the listening together with the policy, because you can't really have one without the other. And is that a sort of risk that sometimes organisations think we can policy our way out of this but forget the other side? Is that something you've...
Of course. I mean, you know, the compliance, and I'm all for compliance. Obviously, it's imperative, but compliance doesn't mean ticking. You know, here's the policy, tick. We've updated it, tick. Here's the other policy, tick. We've made clear everyone's got it. We've made people say they've read it by signing a box. Actually, no. It's a combination of having the policy, making sure people are aware of it, having the right training, and also, and you will have heard this term, I know it's been around for a long time, but storytelling. So people, leaders, middle management, individuals speaking about their experience of raising a grievance, or a leader talking about the value of the disclosures that were made last year to the business and what that meant for the business in a positive way.
Yeah.
So it's that type of thing as well really changes the dial.
Yeah.
And there's been so much focus over the past couple of years on culture and fostering a culture of psychological safety as well.
Yeah.
And that is a huge part of everything we're talking about. And if businesses are recognising the benefit in whistleblowing and speaking up and psychological safety, it's also tied to recognising the benefits with workplace activism as well.
Yeah.
I think they're both very similar.
Yeah, no, and that ties nicely onto the point I wanted to get to, because you mentioned positive, you're talking about the benefits. When we're looking at workplace activism, I think maybe some people would think it's about managing risk and worrying about grievances and all the challenges about it. But actually, I know at CEDR we think there's a tremendous amount of good that can come from recalibrating the relationship between employees and employers, looking at it better, looking at what you can learn from one another. Is that something that you've seen as well, that actually a great deal of good can come from engaging with workplace activism effectively?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's not just seeing it as something which needs to be shut down because there's a risk to it. That might be the case in some situations, but I think it's understanding that there's a spectrum of it, and actually it could be a signifier of a healthy culture if you have issues which are being raised to you which you can then listen to and then respond to accordingly. So it's part of your risk management framework. You can use it to identify where there's areas of risk within the business or areas of need where you need to put some attention, some resource, some benefit there to help get the most of your workforce, or use it as a driver for change. So it's a voice to listen to, for sure.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things we see, because we're obviously lawyers, is that sometimes, not always, one rogue employee, and what I mean by that is an employee cynically using the processes to try to give themselves more leverage in potentially an exit package, or because they dislike someone, or whatever their driver is. But occasionally that one rogue employee can drive people's views of these systems, because if their only experience is to interact with an employee who has used it in a cynical way, they sometimes then apply that experience generically across the whole piece and say, oh, I don't really think it's a very good thing. Now, I think those people are fewer and fewer as they do see the benefits for business. I mean, whistleblowing is just a risk management tool, right? Why wouldn't you want the people that are in your institution flagging to you early on, look, we haven't got enough resource here, there's a risk. So actually, sensible leaders see it in that way. Grievances, not ideal, because it takes up management time. No one wants a grievance, and ideally you would manage it prior to that point. But of course, if it's so serious that someone has felt the need, you need to listen to what they've raised and then think about it, and potentially that may negate further grievances in the future, or you may have spotted a middle manager who isn't managing people very well. So there definitely are upsides to workplace activism.
And if you're not responding to it appropriately, then you may not be meeting the expectations of your workforce, which means you're not going to attract and retain the talent that you want, particularly if we are hearing more anecdotally, as you say, about younger generations of the workforce having more expectations around societal values that they want their employers to take a stance on. So you can't ignore it. I think you do have to embrace it to a large degree.
One of the tensions we see quite a lot with our clients is how they communicate in the aftermath of a activism event.
Yes.
I think the default remains at this point in time that people still do want to close it down. My view is generally that isn't the right way of dealing with communications, because then the workforce thinks there's more there, or senses some secrecy or lack of transparency. And so I think we're seeing now a much more thoughtful approach to communications from employers in the workplace occurring. And I think that will change quite considerably over the next 3 to 5 years. It always takes a while, but I do think we will see the more progressive workplaces engaging in much more open communications with their people to make sure that people realise that when they raise these issues, this is what happens, and less afraid of it. There's always been a fear of saying we're sorry or apologising, but we are nevertheless seeing leaders come out and apologise and saying, actually, we got this wrong, and I think we will see that more and more in the future.
So if we just spotlight diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and that's obviously a sort of quite topical piece, and it's a very important one, and you're seeing that being a sort of real catalyst for workplace activism.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because we are seeing workplace activism arise on both sides of the coin. So at the moment you have a really challenging environment for employers because there's increased pressure for them to drive progress on diversity within the business, meet expectations, achieve the benchmarks that are being set by external parties. And also there's increased governance and reporting on the diversity of their workforce as well. But then equally, given what's been happening in the US back in summer 2023 with their Supreme Court decision with Students for Fair Admissions in Harvard, since that decision, there's been more of a heightened risk of challenge to diversity initiatives in a corporate setting, which is then having a ripple effect over in the UK. And so you're in that conflict between trying to take action to achieve change and progress versus responding to allegations of wokeism and pressure over prioritising diversity initiatives over profit for shareholders and that whole shareholder first mantra versus stakeholder first. So it's a really challenging environment for global businesses particularly, and they're having to navigate achieving the right balance when you're having activism from the workplace, investors, shareholders on both sides of the business case for diversity and where you take it.
When it comes to engaging with workplace activism, and we'll maybe go on to look at some practical tips from what you've seen work and maybe what you've seen not work, but we've talked about grievances as a mechanism for one of these ways to surface, but there are other ways in which we can engage with employees, and mediation type processes are one of them. I know you've both got a lot of experience with those. How do you see them potentially working quite well in this arena where you're dealing with people's emotions and values, fears, worries, ambitions, because of the sort of the flexibility, the way it brings people together? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is an essential tool, and I think all workplaces should think about it in these situations. It won't be right every time, but there's little to be lost, in my view, in deploying workplace mediation when there's maybe two people, one person's raised a grievance about the other. Sometimes actually they're just not functioning well as a team, so you may have a few people beginning to grumble about the behaviours or the tone of an individual who's completely ignorant that they're offsiding or upsetting them in any way. So early intervention and workplace mediation, I think, are very sensible steps. The one thing I would say is it's imperative that you get the right personality to do that, because I have seen it where the wrong person has been identified, because instead of thinking through what you need, what's the skill set, who, people want to deal with these things swiftly, so just find any workplace mediator. So identifying the right person with the right skill set for those people, I think is a very sensible step to take.
On that diversity front, one of the things that we've seen a lot at CEDR is people are assembling, or teams are becoming increasingly diverse because of global workforces. There's people from different cultures, backgrounds, professional experiences. So you're bringing together teams that are diverse, but you don't necessarily get to leverage the benefit of that collective diversity if people can't work effectively together, or managers, leaders can't facilitate dialogue between people, or certain cultural norms are meaning that people are falling out more than they should. So again, the sort of drive to diversity is really important, but only if you can then leverage the benefit of it for the organisation and I suppose for the individuals. And I think it sort of the skills both at a team level and manager level are quite important to that. And it goes back to your point around, okay, speak up, yes, but listening up is probably the missed part or the more important part. Is that something that kind of resonates with you both?
It is, yeah, and I think that's why you have the push on diversity. Diversity is something which is more tangible, you can measure your progress on it, but then you have the other two parts of the equation around equity and inclusion as well. So inclusivity is what will keep your diverse candidates within your business and keep your diverse talent. If they're not feeling welcome and inclusive and they can be themselves at work, once they're there, they're not going to stay.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing a lot of pushback as well, because there's a lot of noise and confusion around what equity means in order to achieve inclusivity and get your diverse candidates through. And how much action can you legally take to make equity happen in the workplace for diverse candidates? And that's where there's a lot of tension and a lot of debate around whether it's equity or equality.
And it's it's challenging.
Yeah.
Because you can have a group where there are opposing beliefs and actually their values of individuals are fundamentally different. Now, is it an employer's responsibility to reconcile those beliefs or values? Probably not. Should an employer try to create an environment or a culture of its own that allows people to work alongside each other and tolerate each other and respect each other? Yes, I think it should be. Mm-hmm. Is that easy? Of course it's not. Yeah. And can you have difficult individuals who will create issues? Of course you can. And then I always say to clients, well, if you've got a difficult individual that is causing infinite issues, don't be afraid to manage that individual. Yeah. Performance managing and calling out bad behaviour is fine. Mm-hmm. That you're not precluded from doing that in creating an inclusive workplace, but I think there is sometimes a bit of a fear in relation to that.
No, absolutely.
But I do think, the workplace should be a place where people feel safe, where people respect each other, tolerance, and enjoy the fact that we don't all think the same or have the same values necessarily.
I think tolerance and respect is everything it comes down to when you're looking at conflicting beliefs in the workplace. Agreed. It's a really technically complex and challenging area from a legal perspective, and then you have an employer who's having to balance the conflicting rights of an individual who has the legal right to express their opinion and manifest their belief versus someone who then shouldn't be harassed by that person's views for doing so. It's really difficult for an employer, and the key message is all about tolerance and respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think on that, and I think you mentioned something earlier, Nicola, about facilitations and bringing people together. And we've worked with a lot of institutions on that, and quite a few universities where they've got quite an activist students. Yeah. And actually setting up structured, deliberate, facilitated sessions with an external facilitator to bring people together to have a better exchange is actually proven to be very helpful in a lot of cases, particularly over issues like Israel-Gaza, which are very, very challenging, and obviously a lot of people are very personally and emotionally connected to it. So actually being deliberate about bringing your employees together to have these discussions, to exchange ideas, I think is quite a good way to go about it. Or certainly we've seen. I don't know if you've seen that play out at all, but
no, I have seen that play out, and I've seen it used, and I think it, again, like all these things, it's about ensuring that you think about it, you prepare for it. These are not easy discussions to have, and to your point on a facilitator, getting the right facilitator in the room is obviously key, but I think it is a positive thing to do.
It would be really great to wrap up the discussion with looking at what practical tips you both have for managers, senior leaders, boards when thinking about workplace activism.
So I'd say be calm, no knee-jerk reactions, don't judge too early, take the time, you've always got longer than you think you have to deal with these issues, listen, make sure you're properly engaging and listening to what people are saying, don't think you hear it, actually hear it, and be open-minded as well.
I think mine are probably very related to that. The first one would be education for senior leaders. So being open to that continuous education piece, because in order to manage the risk of workplace activism effectively, but also embrace the benefits, you have to have a finger on the societal pulse of your workplace, but then also more broadly. So if you're open to that continuous education piece to learn about your workforce, different cultures, different backgrounds, the direction of where things are travelling in a societal context too, then I think that will give you a good foundation for being able to respond more appropriately to these issues. The next point I would mention is around data. So we often get asked by clients how to measure things like ESG within their business and the social side of it, or with diversity and inclusion as well. And with workplace activism, in order to mine some of the benefits that come out of it from that risk management side, you have the data within your company that you can look at. And it might be as subtle as looking at your feedback from your engagement surveys or in your exit interviews, or looking at pockets of retention rates or patterns of behaviour and grievances and conduct issues throughout your business. And if you can look at that data more holistically and see where there might be issues or trends or positives, you can be more proactive about how you react to it rather than reacting to the crisis when it happens.
Perfect. Laurie, Nicola, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I think we're sort of in agreement this is not something that's going to go away. It's here to stay, so hopefully there'll be a chance to follow up and continue the conversation.